Hey, Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. A few weeks ago, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern announced their intention to merge into what would be the first integrated coast-to-coast railroad in the history of the United States. If approved by the Surface Transportation Board, this would narrow the number of Class 1 freight railroads from 6 to 5 and could trigger even further consolidation by the remaining railroads in response. For reference, as recently as 1979, there were still 40 Class 1 railroads, and the 6 that remain already more or less divvy the country up into 3 areas with only 2 railroads operating in each one. Looked at from one perspective, this merger would signify the elimination of one final choke point in the movement of freight across the country on an infrastructure that wants to be big and continuous. Seen another way, it is a last-ditch effort on the part of railroad corporations to hold on to the backing of Wall Street as the dopaminergic dividends that have accompanied a decade of destructive cost-cutting and rate increases as a substitute for providing competitive service begin to reach their limit. There is a lot to be said about the context in which this is occurring. The extreme consolidation of market power that has already taken place over the last 45 years, and the deliberately lax regulatory policy that allowed it to happen. We'll be digging into all of this in the coming episodes, and also into the question of whether UP and NS's attempt to push the needle even further might actually create an opportunity for us to renegotiate how we do rail transport in this country. Another thing that will be going on as the STB begins weighing its options regarding the merger is that Congress will be considering a pair of bills that could substantially alter the conditions governing how railroads conduct business by strengthening their obligations and incentives to serve the public. All this creates a situation in which Class 1 railroads, a group that prefers to keep to the shadows while it extracts billions in profit from critical national infrastructure, might find themselves once again exposed to public scrutiny. At the very least, it provides further impetus for the various parties whose lives are most impacted by the way railroads operate, such as shippers, railroad workers, and trackside communities, to continue to come together as unlikely allies, as they have begun to do in recent years, around the common goal of reorienting the railroad system toward a less harmful and more constructive future. For today's episode, Reconnect America host and Solutionary Rail director Bill Moyer got to speak with someone who will undoubtedly have a key role to play in how all of this unfolds. He is Greg Regan, president of the Transportation Trades Division of the AFL-CIO. Their conversation ranged from the shared interest that all transportation workers, including truckers, have in a healthy rail system, to the significance and timeliness of Senator Tammy Baldwin's Reliable Rail Service Act and of Senator Ed Markey's All Aboard Act, to the stakes involved for workers and for the country in the proposed Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern merger. Here is Bill's conversation with Greg Regan.
Greg, congratulations on your recent re-election to your position.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it and are honored that you're taking the time to hang out with us and talk about rail and the Transportation Trades Department that you lead and have led since 2021. You know, it feels like it's always useful to get into the conversation by learning more about you and your journey. You've worked in Congress, I believe, and you were at TTD prior to being in the position of president. And then you came into your position through a very tragic circumstance of the tragic passing of former President Larry Willis. I first was introduced to President Willis during the 17-hour marathon Surface Transportation Board hearing some years ago, and I was so impressed by his advocacy. So how has it been for you to move into this position and, in a sense, have to expand from the previous policy areas that you were handling into just this very large umbrella of transportation and with responsibility and accountability to so many people and so many unions? Could you share a little bit about your journey?
Sure. My background, when I was working in Congress, I handled a number of different issues like anybody that works in Congress on the legislative side. Oddly enough, none of them were transportation. I did just about everything other than transportation and women's health, basically, while I was there. But I did handle labor issues and union issues for a very pro-union member of Congress. And the more that I learned about the labor movement, the more I learned about what collective bargaining rights can provide for people, the way it can provide opportunities, the more I thought that when I leave Congress, which I knew was going to happen eventually, I wanted to work in or around the labor movement. And TTD provided me that opportunity to be in the labor movement. I was able to learn pretty quickly some of the transportation policy issues because at our core, every single transportation issue is a labor issue. There are still core collective bargaining rights, safety, job security, compensation that is at the core of all of our advocacy when we're pushing for better transportation policies here in the United States. So, it's been here for almost 14 years at TTD. So it's been quite a while where I've been able to build on my, knowledge and learn a lot from so many people around me, especially Larry and his predecessor, Ed, that really helped me understand the labor movement more deeply and understand how our advocacy can really benefit people. When I took over as president after that tragedy, it was during COVID. We had just passed the CARES Act. President Biden had just been elected, although he had not taken office yet. And we knew that going into President Biden's administration, we were going to have to do another bit of relief for transportation systems and COVID relief. We got the American Recovery Act done around that time. And we also knew that infrastructure was going to be really high on his agenda. We knew that an infrastructure law was going to be not one of the things that a president talks about doing, but actually number one with the bullet in terms of his agenda. So we had to be ready for it. And frankly, we couldn't have asked for a better group of people to work with in the executive branch than we got with that administration. And we couldn't have asked for a better opportunity to try to put our members front and center when it came to the national policy discussion and everything that they do to keep our country moving, even the ones that people may not see or may not recognize as so vital to our economy.
Right. The Biden administration did sort of knock it out of the park. We kept hearing about infrastructure week for years and years and years. And then we actually seemed to actually get some action on infrastructure. And, for all of the people's criticism of a Sleepy Joe or whatever, there were a lot of competent people working and collaborating with Congress. A lot of shit got done. And the partners and the engagement of stakeholders was very impressive. So the engagement of labor, engagement of environmental justice and others seemed to be just unprecedented in my lifetime in terms of the ability to actually feel like if you had a good idea, if you had experience, you could bring it to bear and their doors could be opened. You would have an opportunity to at least test your ideas. So you must have had just a huge impact on the bipartisan infrastructure law. And that work obviously continues, right? We're not done with that work. So I noticed that in the last number of weeks, both Senator Baldwin's Reliable Rail Act was resubmitted, as well as the All Aboard Act by Senator Markey and Representative DeLuzio. So I'm wondering if we could touch base on each of those, because I noticed that TTD is an endorser of both of those pieces of legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to do that. But maybe before we do that, why don't we let people know more about what is the Transportation Trades Department and why is it such an important actor in the development of transportation policy?
TTD we're a unique body in the labor movement. We don't have an organizing department. We will not bargain contracts for our unions, our affiliated unions. We don't do state work. We focus on federal legislative and regulatory work and advocacy on behalf of our 39 affiliated unions. So essentially, if you look at lobbying firms all throughout the city, I mean, every corporate entity in this country has a lobbyist in some way, shape, or form. It could be through a trade association. It could be from a big law firm. But, labor doesn't always have that voice. That's what we provide. We provide that expertise in terms of how the federal government works, and we use that expertise to advocate on behalf of working people and on behalf of unions and advocating for pro-worker policies. And of course, in an area like transportation, there are so many areas, different modes. It may seem like aviation policy is so divorced from city bus policy or from passenger rail policy or from school bus drivers or longshore issues. But there's so many, all of this is interconnected. Every single one of these modes relies on another in one way, shape, or form. Passenger aviation relies on public transit to get people to the airport. We have public roads and construction and building trained workers. They're all interconnected. And you can look at the cargo side of it as well. I mean, The package that shows up at your door may be delivered by a UPS truck, but it also probably got there from a train, and it probably got to the train from a boat, and at some point was on a long haul truck too. So there is no way that you can just isolate any one part of transportation policy and have, I think, the best outcomes. You need to have a holistic look at overall transportation in order to have a better overall government policy when it comes to transportation. And the other thing that I find really interesting about the work is how we can learn lessons from different modes and apply those lessons to help benefit workers in another area. So if we've dealt with something like assaults on workers on the aviation side, maybe it could be sexual harassment on planes, maybe it can be a physical assault on a customer service agent, a gate agent. And how we solve that from a policy perspective, how can we advocate to get better federal protections or better laws in place to protect these people? We can learn lessons from things that have happened in the bus area and vice versa, or we can apply that to passenger rail workers if you're a conductor on Amtrak, for example. So all of this stuff, I think what we provide is an ability to have lessons learned, shared experience and expertise, and then also be able to speak with one voice so that if there's an issue that may seem like a very, very specific problem for, say, a signal worker on a freight class 1 railroad. But when we're speaking as one voice from TTD, doesn't mean that we're just sticking up for the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen. You also have the airline pilots behind it. You've got the Amalgamated Transit Union, the Transport Workers Union. You've got the air traffic controllers, the longshoremen. That is everybody. That voice, when we send something out, it's approved. It's supported by every single one of those 39 unions, which adds power and leverage when we're going up on Capitol Hill or when we're writing a letter to the President of the United States advocating for the worker issues.
Wow. So another thing that strikes me when you speak about that is how consolidation in these various industries also is a common theme and impacts workers. So later, I don't think I want to go into it right yet, but I do think that the issue of the Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern merger and how that impacts our freight system and workers and how it changes the game or shifts the playing field and the realm of the possible. Let's make sure we get to that in our conversation because it's very not just in the news, but on a lot of people's minds right now, especially as they intersect with rail transport. So one of the things that we've been grappling with in the Reconnect America podcast series is the different types of relationships that the public have and the government has with different forms of transportation. So we have public funding of highways and then public funding of interstate freeways. And we have public funding of airports and air traffic control. And then we have this hodgepodge of a history of various interventions in the rail system from the very early on, land grants to the taking control of them in World War I to Amtrak relieving common carrier obligation to serve passengers by taking over passenger service to the establishment of Conrail to rescue a part of the freight system to then staggers and then one after another consolidation. So the history of rail is very complex, but it's nominally said to be, under the control of private corporations. It's putting essential critical national infrastructure in the service of generating private profits for corporations and their shareholders. And so it feels like there's a somewhat different kind of relationship to roads, airways, and railroads. Is that true? Or how do you think about public engagement and the public's role in the railroads versus the public's investment in the highway system?
Well, look, you're right. There is a difference, certainly a difference in how the freight railroads, the class 1s, operate and how they think of themselves, as opposed to even Amtrak, which I would consider public transportation, all the commuter rail systems, many of which run on their own lines, but some of which run on class 1 lines. But, we also do invest public money into our freight rail system as well. This idea that class 1s do not accept any public money, they maintain all their own track and their own fleet, that is true in a very narrow sense. It's not true when you look at the investments that are made in, for example, connecting our ports with our railroad infrastructure, which is public money that's invested. If you look at most of the grade crossing elimination or modernization issues, that is also public money that goes into the system. Look at CRISI grants and various other types of federal investments that go into improving our overall freight network. Those are not checks that are going directly to the Class 1 railroads, but they are all public spending that are going to benefit our freight network and ultimately benefit the Class 1s themselves. So I think that there does need to be, considering the amount that we invest as a country into our rail network and our freight rail network as well, I think we do need to start thinking about it less so as just interfering with private business operations. I don't think that's true. And I think given they're important to our overall economy, how vital they are. And you just have to go back a few years to when there was the collective bargaining battle between all the unions and all the Class 1 railroads, that Congress intervened and prevented a work stoppage on all those Class 1s specifically because of how vital our rail network is to the national economy. They did that under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. They stepped in to prevent what they would perceive as an economic calamity that would result in a shutdown of our freight system. So when you put all of that together, in addition to the common carrier obligations that Senator Baldwin's bill, which we discussed briefly, would seek to strengthen a little bit, this is a public good. While there's a lot of private profits being made, there is so much that's important to our overall public good that I think lawmakers and I think the general public need to start demanding more from the Class 1 railroads, honestly. And the same way we demand more from private airlines and service. There's always a lot of focus when there are big delays or a lot of flight cancellations or things like that. I mean, lawmakers get involved. They start asking questions. How is this happening? They demand better from those airlines. And I think we have to start shifting our national mindset towards demanding more from those Class 1 railroads. And even though they're not carrying people, not carrying any more than the two people operating that train, they're carrying sort of the economic lifeblood of our country. And as such, we need to be able to demand accountability from them the same way we demand accountability from other private actors in transportation.
That's very well said. Thank you. You raised the issue of common carrier obligations. I looked through Senator Baldwin's bill this morning just to update myself. And one thing that concerns me is that though it's clarifying common carrier obligations under the current regulatory regime, common carrier obligations only really apply, as far as I can tell, to non-exempted commodities, meaning everything but grain, crude oil, coal, and some hazardous chemicals, everything other than those commodities have been exempted from common carrier obligations.
Yeah.
So unless the Surface Transportation Board does something, or unless Congress calls upon the Surface Transportation Board to revoke those commodity exemptions, it's hard to see how clarifying common carrier obligations are really going to expand service to American industries that would benefit from returned access to competitive rail shipping.
Yeah, and that's why we support the legislation. I mean, the economic regulatory body for freight rail is the Surface Transportation Board. That's the economic regulator. The safety regulator is the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration. But if that's the body that is going to be tasked with holding them accountable for their common carrier obligations, for what their duties are to our country and to their customers, they need to have the tools in their toolbox to be able to effectively regulate. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here, is to make sure that the STB has the tools necessary to be an effective regulator. And right now, I think I'm not sure that any board members would outright say we need more tools, we need more authority, because they don't want to undermine their existing authority for good reason. Those of us from the outside, advocates, including shipping organizations and including all of rail labor, see this as an opportunity to try to, again, bring more accountability to the Class 1s.
You know, you just raised shippers in the same sentence with labor.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that was extremely disappointing about Congress undermining the railroad workers' capacity to express their power through a strike a few years ago is that shippers abandoned labor, when shippers and labor, in my opinion, have a lot in common in terms of the need to improve rail service and guarantee a more robust and reliable system. So, going forward, do you see opportunities for shippers and labor to find common cause in how we put railroad back on the screen, if you will, or in the imaginations or in the minds of regular people about, or even just freaking legislators and experts? Maybe this is a separate conversation, honestly, because I liken the Class 1 railroads to the first Star Wars movie where the Obi-Wan Kenobi thing, where the Jedi mind trick of these are not the droids you're looking for. I feel like the railroads since Staggers have been, we're not the droids you're looking for, but they're exactly the droids we're looking for. Okay, put a pin in that one. But going back to this issue of solidarity across sectors between shippers and labor in general, do you see opportunities for alliance building that have yet to be tapped?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing to remember is that this idea that we have worked with shippers and we had to really talk to them and work together on making sure the language of the Senator Baldwin bill was good, that's a very new relationship. For most of the time that, this could go back to the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then that became the Surface Transportation Board, a lot of the fights that they were dealing with were around freight rates. So you're talking about the actual railroad rates being charged. And a lot of times what the shippers wanted in terms of reduced rates were different than what were in labor unions' interest, because that ultimately comes into compensation and can come back at the bargaining table for a lot of different ways. So we didn't have a lot of aligned interest because most of it was about economic disagreement. And we had a different relationship with the employers, with the Class 1s for much of that time. That really changed with precision scheduled railroading and what we're seeing now in terms of the focus on shareholder return over all else. And the fact that we've had 30% of the rail workforce gutted over the last 7 or 8 years, and we continue to see more of that. We continue to see people just trying to reduce headcount over and over again. And the economic impact of that is poor service. You reduce all this workforce, you cut back on your infrastructure, you go with longer trains and fewer frequencies, and you're going to have a negative impact on service. So it's been sort of a forced uneasy alliance because the actions by management have really unified us through their gutting of the workforce and the reductions of service. So now we have a little bit more of an aligned interest, because I do think that if we start focusing on better safety practices in the freight railroad industry, if we are going to focus on workforce levels and how that ties directly to service levels and customer satisfaction, helping us is going to help them. Helping the labor movement have a safer, better staffed railroad system will help the customers along the way. So I think the more we're able to sort of show that our interests are aligned, that our goals are consistent with your goals, I think that we're going to find more opportunities to work together on different things.
And to the extent that it is possible to reshore manufacturing and to claw back some of the damage of 45 years of neoliberal policies where we're always chasing this slippery slope to the bottom in order for profit maximization, one would hope that shippers see and manufacturers find common cause with a return of service. Now, I'm wondering about your interpretation of Senator Baldwin's act and the fact that it does have a lot of line items to define what is reliable service. But if it only applies to coal, oil, and wheat, we're not quite hitting the mark. It feels like we really got to deal with those commodity exemptions. Am I missing something in that reading?
No, I don't think you're missing something, but I do think if you're targeting those larger, if you're looking at bulk, I mean, how many trains do you see go by that are a lot of big oil tankers and a lot of coal trains, or you see agricultural goods that are being shipped there? That is a huge portion of the amount of stuff that's being carried on freight rail. So if you do address that, I think other customers will benefit from an improved service. The thing that always frustrates me more than anything else, honestly, and I tell this to folks I know in the Class 1s or the AAR, I want you to grow. I want your railroad to be thriving. I want to see fewer trucks on the road. I want to see more people employed, and I want to see them fairly compensated for the work they're doing. But I think it's better for the country. It's better for the environment. It's better for our economy if we have a robust freight rail system and one that's operating safely. So in a weird way, I'm almost like, help me help you. here because we want you to grow. We want you to expand. But at a certain point, in order to truly expand, they're going to have to invest some of those profits back into their system. And that includes hiring people and includes investing in infrastructure that would cut into that quarterly return. And that's not a step that I think many of them are willing to take right now. And what we've seen increasingly are these private equity groups. We saw the Ancora fight at Norfolk Southern last year. And we've seen Ancora is coming back with these other railroads, including CSX now. Again, the incentive structure is there that having a growing, healthy, expanding rail system is not consistent necessarily with the goals of some of the investors who see an opportunity to make as much money as quickly as possible. And so there really is a dissonance there between what the incentive structures are in terms of what the federal government or what workers or what customers see and what the actual management side in terms of shareholder engagement are. And that's creating a more and more of a problem in the industry.
So what comes to mind is this idea that railroads have used lots of mechanisms for maximizing profit, from consolidation to trying to make more by doing less, by controlling access to the infrastructure, rather than competing by providing better service, like growing through service. And we had a great conversation with someone recently about organic and inorganic growth in the industry. Inorganic growth being that through consolidations and controlling access, using their monopolistic control over an infrastructure as a way of squeezing more profit and reducing costs. But organic growth being through expanding their service, having more customers. Carload service is down. There's been hope that intermodal would soften the blow of some of the loss of coal. So I get what you're saying in terms of if we can fix the service and the requirements for service for these large commodities, that would put us on a path towards creating better service and protecting the common carrier obligations of others in the future.
And by the way, one thing I would add too is that if we are successful in, reshoring or getting a bigger market share on manufactured products in this country, and I think there's a couple of ways between the CHIPS Act and the tax incentives for microchips, and then of course, at least the stated goal of some of the tariff policies that we've seen recently. But regardless of whether you want to use the tax incentive structure, same with the IRA on renewable energy products, things like that. Whether you're using the tax incentive structure or a tariff structure, the outcome, I think, for both was the desired outcome is greater manufacturing. And if we have greater manufacturing, there's going to be a much higher demand for rail service to move those goods to market, to get them to ship overseas or for markets domestically. So you're going to see more and more people with some skin in the game on the quality of rail service. And that as well could end up being more opportunity for us to have more allies and more people out there paying attention to the performance of the railroads and how they're actually serving customers.
Greg, you mentioned, like a lot of us, we'd like to see fewer trucks on the road, especially what we're talking about is the long haul trucking.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we measure the amount of commodities they're traveling on trucks, the ton miles of freight that's moving on the roads, that's long haul, meaning over 500 miles, it's nearly 1 trillion ton miles per year. That has a really detrimental effect on public in multiple ways. And maybe a small portion, probably less than 20% of that is greenhouse gases. And the vast majority of it has to do with safety, road wear and tear, congestion, public health, et cetera. So can you go into a little bit of detail why you'd like to see less trucks on the road?
Most of where trucks can be so vital are in that last mile, first mile, last mile type of distribution in cities and smaller distances. It is just from an economic perspective and from an overall environmental perspective, it is better overall to have more of that cargo moving over to freight rail. It is the safest way, although we'd like to see it be safer. We think there's always ways they can improve safety, but it is still the safest way to transport hazardous materials. And it is still the most efficient way to transport bulk goods, including grain or chemicals or oil. So I don't think that it's necessarily robbing Peter to pay Paul, because we're still going to need a robust trucking industry. It's still very interconnected. It's just a shifting of how we're allocating those resources and how those jobs are integrated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I had a conversation with a Teamster representative some years ago, and I was urging them to think more in terms of quality of miles rather than quantity of miles, and how much easier it is to organize workers who get to go home at night, who get to be able to attend union meetings, rather than the long haul truckers who are the most marginalized workforce in that industry, as far as I can tell, them, the drayage truckers. So yeah, it's interesting. I appreciate your insights into that. And it does feel like there's opportunities for alliance building between truckers and advocates for a better rail service. You have advocated for the two-person crew, minimum two-person crew on trains, and Solutionary Rails history is very much wrapped up with our collaboration with Railroad Workers United and learning from railroad workers directly about the importance of having a minimum of two people on a train, especially these super long trains. Do you have any concerns that the two-person crew standard is vulnerable to being potentially weakened?
Yes, I do. I mean, look, the last time we had a rule toward the end of the Obama administration, we had a proposed rule on crew size for railroads. It wasn't able to be completed before the end of that term. And the Trump administration then, the first time around, came in and took a rule that was laid out on a platter for them. They had already gone through all the comment period, and they just changed it all around, removed the mandate for two people inside every train. And then not only that, but preempted all the state laws that already existed. And there were something like 20 on the books at the time of state laws mandating two people on the train inside their states. So it was basically a complete reversal of the original intent of the rule. This time around, we finalized it. It was the priority of Amit Bose and the FRA to finalize that crew size rule before they left office. They did. The nominee for FRA administrator, Mr. Fink, has stated that he is going to defend that rule. And I've spoken with folks at the current FRA that they are going to defend that rule, despite the railroads asking for them to reconsider it. But whether they weaken it or how they want to adjust it, that's an open question. We haven't seen any indication of that yet, but really the only way that we can make sure that it is protected as much as possible is to get it passed into federal law, not just through a regulation. Regulations can be modified, removed, wavered, all those things. We need to have it in federal law. And that's why we're continuing to advocate in the context of a surface transportation reauthorization or any other transportation safety legislation that there is a federal mandate for crew size, a minimum crew size of two people, and it needs to be written into code. That's a heck of a lot easier to overturn than a regulation.
Can you, in a brief manner, describe why minimum two-person crew is important?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a team. One part of it is accountability and redundancy inside the cab. The other part is if there's an emergency, and there's no better example of how they work together in an emergency than what happened in East Palestine, where there was a derailment. There were toxic chemicals that were spilling out. There was a fire, and the conductor went back, decoupled the train. The engineer was able to move the train several miles away so that it didn't turn into a chain reaction and a worse crisis. And then they got back together and were able to speak with first responders and make sure that you had the information they needed to be able to try to address that. That isn't a bit of an extreme example about where they, quick thinking, but that's the type of thing that having two people there, especially with trains that are 3-4 miles long, that are so vital for them to be able to work together, not only to just operate safely, but also when something does go wrong, they work together as that team.
One thing that I have not heard people refer to, and it struck me when I was listening to a podcast, Volts by David Roberts, about the grid and power generation infrastructure, that they're increasingly concerned about AI and hacking of that infrastructure. And the legacy power production like dams and such, they aren't necessarily controlled remotely via an internet connection. And what struck me is like, wow, we should really start to have that conversation about trains, because it seems to me like you'd really want a kill switch if a system was hacked. And if you don't have a human being or two human beings on a train could be a very powerful weapon. And I think that there's a national security element that we haven't really tapped into yet, but perhaps in the future. So moving on, the other piece of legislation that TTD just endorsed or re-endorsed, as we did, is the All Aboard Act, resubmitted by Senator Markey with Representative DeLuzio. Is there anything that you'd like to say specifically about the All Aboard Act?
Yeah. One of the things that would be a really important aspect of the All Aboard Act that I think is slightly underappreciated, and you were making a point earlier about our funding for roads and highways and for airports, and a lot of that is formula funding, meaning that you don't have to apply for grants, that's going to be there. We don't have that same system for passenger rail, and that's a really important part of this legislation to create formula funding for passenger rail and for the expansion of passenger rail in this country. And it builds upon some existing programs, including Chrissy and other things like that, but really dedicates more federal funding and consistent federal funding for passenger rail in this country. And, for me, passenger rail is such an underutilized asset in this country and one that truly could be a growth opportunity for so many folks. And all you need to point to, in my view, is some of the route expansion that Amtrak has done recently. As part of the money that they got through the infrastructure law, this is not even laying new track. This was service that was done, but as part of a long distance train. But between Minneapolis and Chicago, they launched the Borealis service. And it's just one frequency a day, leaving at 11:30 from Minneapolis and 11:30 from Chicago and passing. And the popularity of that train is astounding. It's one of the best performing state supported routes. Amtrak has considered adding another frequency because of the popularity of that train. And it shows, and that's a place going through a bunch of really small towns. And it's not the most highly dense corridor that you can have out there, but it is popular because people don't want to drive 400 miles. If you're going to fly that, you have to get to an airport, and it doesn't actually save you any time. I think there's a real demand for it, but we have to be able to invest in it and have the reliability and have the making sure that people know that they can get on a train and arrive when they're supposed to. But it requires consistent investment. You get what you pay for. And we have paid for bad service for 50 years. And now we have an opportunity to start getting towards a better track and actually meeting the demand that is there.
Well said. And those places in between are critical. And that's one of the things you don't get when you try to put in a bullet train is you don't get those places in between. The other thing that I want to raise is, well, there are a couple things in that bill. There's the workforce development. That's awesome because we need more railroad workers and we need the railroad jobs to be great jobs. The other is the potential for dedicated passenger track. Having that investment in infrastructure does a couple of things. One, it opens up the opportunity for electrification that the freight railroads are not going to do on their own. The class ones are not going to instigate on their own. But by using dedicated passenger track, we can start to sort of implement this even discontinuous electrification along the system that creates an infrastructure for future freight electrification. The other piece and another ally that's super important to our work is the environmental justice communities and the support for reducing emissions around rail yards, ports, et cetera, through the electrification of rail yards. That is a high priority for us. And I was really glad to see the mention of reducing emissions for communities and workers, because the workers are often from those communities and they're also directly impacted.
Yes.
It also seems to me to be setting the bar for a kind of public-private partnership on this infrastructure that we have not seen perhaps ever. And so I want us to spend some of our last time together considering the potential relevance of this proposed merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. And what does that open up for us? How does that shift the public conversation or perhaps bring rail into the public's perception?
I mean, we already have an extremely consolidated freight rail network. I mean, you essentially have duopolies on either side of the Mississippi. You've got Norfolk Southern and CSX east of the Mississippi and Union Pacific and BNSF west. And right now, that's already, I've heard some people say duopoly quite a bit, but others have even said it's monopolistic because some of them are serving different communities. So any further consolidation in this industry is going to require some pretty intense scrutiny. We haven't taken a firm position yet. Some unions have, some have not. A lot of people are going to be examining this very closely, and this is going to be a process. I mean, this is going to take a little while before there's any resolution here. But for us, look, how this is going to affect workforce issues is going to be a huge concern for us. And that includes both employment levels, safety, as well as compensation and how this impacts rail workers on both sides of the Mississippi as part of this merger. And that's something that we in our legal representations will certainly be scrutinizing quite a bit. And the safety aspect too. I mean, the more you consolidate and the more you eliminate competition, you end up with less accountability a lot of the time. And I'm sure that there are going to be service concerns as well from the shipping community. But we're going to focus on the worker side first, and then we'll let the shipping community sort of fight on their side for now, and we'll see where those interests align. But I think this is a really tricky one. And we've seen a lot of big mergers, and there's always antitrust concerns around some of these larger mergers in other areas, whether it be in media. Well, media is the one that we've seen a lot of recently. But in this case, we have that added dimension of the common carrier obligation, that there is an additional test that needs to be made in addition to the normal antitrust concerns that we see from large corporate mergers. So this is going to be it's going to be really interesting to see how this national conversation develops and how regulators take a look at this.
Yeah, and speaking of regulators, the Surface Transportation Board, they're the ones who are going to get to make the call on this. And they've got that's 5 seats, only 4 of which are actually filled. And I know that was kind of a disappointment to you that we did not see. If you want to, you could speak to the failure of the Biden administration to fill that final position, because that could make a really big difference right now. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the vetting and the nominating process and then getting it confirmed, they ran out of time. And I think that they probably waited too long to decide on a person. But at the end of the day, even if we had had a 3-2 majority of Democratic appointees, the Trump administration, if they didn't like it, can come in day one and remove one of the Democrats and put in their majority. That's how the system works. So they still haven't nominated somebody to fill that last seat. But if this were something that were a priority for them, they could have changed it to a 3-2 Republican majority right away.
And regardless, isn't our challenge really about power building and building alliances?
Yeah.
And so, making the case for the public's interest in a robust, reliable rail system that is clean and electrified, that has great jobs, that is competitive and has competition built in within it and can compete with trucks, as far as I can tell, is in all of our interest. Now,
Yes.
one of the things I wonder about is, this is a sea change. If Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific merge, some people say, well, that pretty much requires BNSF and CSX to merge. And so whether or not that's true, I'm not qualified to say, but it does feel to me like we've had a whole history of consolidation. And now we're getting to the last efforts of squeezing more out of less. And so maybe this is the pivot point. Maybe this is the opportunity for us to articulate a vision for rail that does not burden the system with producing maximum profits for short-term investors like Ancora and such. Maybe this is an opportunity to provide an off-ramp for Class 1 railroads from running infrastructure and let them compete on service and let the public invest in the infrastructure, let the public invest in dedicated passenger lanes, let the public invest in the electrification of yards and track. Maybe this is our opportunity to fight for an open access system that has as its mission to provide maximum service to all communities around the country for the benefit of those communities and our economy and our workers and industry, and not for anonymous financial pirates or vultures.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And I hope that this is, these are moments when there's increased public scrutiny and increased scrutiny from legislators and regulators on an industry that I've always sort of thought is more of like this quiet, silent economic giant in the background that most people don't think about, but actually affects every single American's life. Every time they go to the grocery store, every time you get a new auto part or something like that, you are relying on a robust rail network to have access to all those goods so often. And yet people don't think about it. It just shows up there. And so when we saw, for example, the collective bargaining fight last time around, and when you see something like East Palestine, it shines a spotlight on the industry. That was how the whole sick leave, the push for sick leave for workers became a major issue, because during the collective bargaining fight, that issue was highlighted. And most people were like, wait, what? These workers that are outside all day don't have sick leave? And that wasn't inserted into the collective bargaining agreement, but the constant scrutiny and pressure from the Biden administration officials, from legislators, from unions, meant that within a couple of years after that collective bargaining fight, we went from 5% of workers that had access to paid sick days to now about 90% of workers have access to paid sick days. And that was a direct result of public scrutiny and public attention. And this merger, I think, will provide another opportunity for enhanced scrutiny and enhanced attention about how they're operating and their role in our economic well-being in this country. And I hope we take good advantage of it, because we have plenty of examples about how mergers can affect service and affect workforce, and it's usually not the best. So we have a lot of opportunity to pry more and really hold them accountable.
Right. Someone said to me recently, whoever tells the best story wins. And it seems like it's incumbent upon us as advocates for a kind of populism that appeals to the best in people rather than the worst in them, to tell a better story. And so I want to open it up for you to share anything that you would like to say about what is the story that we can be telling about the importance of workers, of our workforce and the public interests, and how solidarity and expanding solidarity is going to help us actually make America great.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. We just did our convention, as you mentioned at the top, and we did it up in New York City, and we chose New York City for a reason. You're talking about the largest city in the country that has the largest transit system in the country. It's got a major port, the largest East Coast port. You've got 3 major airports right there. You've got commuter rail system. It's the heart of the busiest passenger rail corridor in the country. And it's a high union density city as well. So for us, it was an opportunity to showcase what all of these workers do, and that they keep this city moving and they keep our country moving. The workers that I'm lucky enough to represent are the ones driving us forward. And especially after COVID, they're the ones who kept us going through COVID. They're the ones who made sure we had food at the grocery stores, that nurses and doctors were able to get to the hospitals, that drugs were able to get to drugstores. And then, of course, coming out of that, rebuilding out of the pandemic, and we saw with the investment in infrastructure that transportation workers across all these modes are the ones who are going to build a better future going forward. Whether they're building the trains, whether they're building the roads, whether they're operating all this equipment, that is our path towards a brighter future. And we have to have that solidarity in the workforce side, because otherwise what we're stuck with is people looking for pennies and trying to get as much profit out of as possible. Whereas we're actually advocating for growing these overall systems and providing better service and actually creating a modern infrastructure network that serves everybody in this country better and also provides good jobs, because that's good for the country too.
Right on. Greg Regan, thank you so much for hanging out with us on Reconnect America. I really appreciate your leadership. Congratulations on your reelection as president of the Transportation Trades Department. We really appreciate you and your leadership, and we look forward to working together or supporting or being informed in whatever ways we can. And we hope to touch base with you in the future. Thank you again.
Yeah, anytime. I appreciate it. It was a good conversation.
That was Greg Regan, president of the Transportation Trades Division of the AFL-CIO, in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. If you like what you heard in this interview and think more people should hear it, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. You can also support this work by pitching in and getting involved at solutionaryrail.org.